Welcome to the Convergence podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand. On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Convergence.fm. Continuing from our last episode, we've got questions that you, the listeners, have sent us, and in some case, Reddit links of questions on popular Reddit forums around product and product delivery that you've sent us. And I have with me our producer, Doug Branson, joining us once again to help answer and uncover some of the questions from our experience or a client's experience. Some of the topics that we cover are test-driven development, how it relates to the book Essentialism by Greg McKeown, how often as a manager you should have one-on-ones with your engineers, how your business needs to evolve product strategy and delivery as you gain more customers. We also talk about responding as an individual contributor to some rough feedback that one of the listeners got in a performance review, and also talking about how to articulate the value proposition of your product and minimize the amount of demo time and founder time taken in sales. With that, here is Doug joining me once again to answer your questions. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. What is the first question that we got?
Our first question comes from user Lapke, who asks, I've got kind of a two-part question. I just joined a new team and I've been trying to get folks to buy in to test-driven development. Not just for the sake of code quality, but more as a mindset, like defining what good looks like before we even start building. I found it helps me stay focused and intentional instead of just reacting to whatever's on fire that day. The thing is, though, I also just finished reading Essentialism, and it really hit home. The idea of doing fewer things but doing them better. So I'm wondering, have you seen examples where product or even business teams apply that same kind of test-driven thinking to their goals, like writing the tests for what success looks like at the beginning of the quarter or the year and using that to filter out the noise? And maybe more importantly, how do you get a team on board with that kind of shift when everyone's already drowning in Slack messages and OKRs?
Thanks, Doug. I think they're referring to the book Essentialism by Greg McKeown. And the listeners pointed out something really astute. I'm going to make an assumption that they're probably an engineer or a leader of an engineering team, in that they're really trying to drive a lot of coding practices. But the thing that they're doing, I think that's really astute and impressive, is that they're thinking about test-driven development as a mindset and not a very tactical quality assurance methodology. And to their credit, it's something that can be applied not just to the code itself to verify that the code works, but it can also be applied to set intention in the first place and apply focus. A lot of the time, teams that do test-driven development will end up with way less code because we're really being clear upfront about what we need to do. And so once we've written the tests and then we're looking to get the test passing, we have to do a minimum amount of work, just barely enough to get those tests passing. And it really saves us the trouble from getting distracted and over-engineering or gold plating maybe. And that amount of focus is what ends up making a huge difference between feeling like you're drowning in Slack messages and OKRs versus having some semblance of control or predictability, because you're choosing to only focus on what's important and cutting out all the noise. Working your way up the stack, maybe from the code, it's not just our code, it's integrations with the code that people write tests for. It's not even just the code. We also make product or customer assumptions around whether the product can help the customer do this, whether the customer will do a certain thing. We'll make business assumptions about how much traction, engagement, maybe even revenue or profit comes as a result of actions that we take. And stating these upfront versus looking back and rationalizing have a super powerful effect of focusing the team so that we are not at the risk of doing things outside of there. And, since you mentioned the book Essentialism, this is something that I think also acts as a great journal entry almost. If you're able to write down your experiments for your product, for your business assumptions, for your market assumptions, when we're looking back, and oftentimes when things are not going right and stress and anxiety is high, we will have like this sinking feeling in our hearts of like, what the hell was I thinking when we decided to do this? And writing these tests down in the form of hypotheses, not just for your code, but also for your product, for your team decisions and everything else, kind of helps you a lot with looking back and helping remember all the various factors that are into play and what led to the decision that you're making, which is extremely useful for learning from our own mistakes, as well as onboarding other team members and using these as case studies so that they can think alongside the learnings and the more mature style of thinking that you have now versus having your teammates kind of go back to scratch one. The same applies for OKRs, where defining those OKRs up as questions or hypotheses as a start of a quarter can be a much better language than as assertions where you feel like there's a high level of certainty.
And we actually have a couple of episodes on OKRs. You can find one in October of 2024 with guest Josh Seiden, and a compilation episode that we did at the beginning of this year, 2025. That was a best of episode on OKRs. I will link both in the show notes.
That's a great reminder. I think framing OKRs as a question is something that I may have very well borrowed from Josh, and that's something that we can find in that episode. And it invites a lot more curiosity as well as intention setting and making sure that those OKRs are really engaging before we start to execute against them. The other thing that I kind of a bonus on essentialism is, you could take this TDD mindset and apply it even outside of work. For example, my girlfriend and I are headed to Portugal soon. And when we decided we were going to go there, we kind of both had a hunch that we wanted to go and maybe different reasons. So, I was the nerdy guy, and thankfully she humors this. We sat down and wrote down what we were looking for out of this trip to Portugal. It helped us validate that Portugal, in fact, is the right place to go. And then once we started getting into research mode about what spots we want to hit in Lisbon and any road trips maybe we may want to do, we had a list for each of us that were thankfully not too far apart in terms of what we wanted out of the trip. So it made it really easy to kind of separate out the stuff that, is likely going to be what we wanted versus the FOMO stuff, which there's, millions of posts about Portugal on social media today about what you should do. And setting this intention before kind of getting mired in what we should spend our time on was super helpful. So credit to the listener for figuring that out. And then the bonus there is that it's not just at work, you can apply it at home. And then another thing that comes to mind for me is that Greg McKeown has written another great book called Effortless. And if you're trying to connect his material back to extreme programming or running a software team, I would think of the book Essentialism more like the strategy or the applying focus and priority. And then this book Effortless is more around how do we operationalize this and do this with more efficiency. So that's something that the listener could take away as well if they enjoyed his first book.
Yeah, all great points there. And the only way that you and your partner could align on that trip is if you both just stated very clearly what you were looking to get out of it, right? And so the idea there being that the only way to alignment, the only way to converge, if you will, on goals is for everyone to state clearly what they want. So as a follow-up question, I'm wondering from your perspective, that seems like an obvious concept to me, right? Like teams, everybody has to know what they want and how they want to proceed in order to figure out what's the best way, to get everybody on that same page. Why is that such a barrier for teams? Like just clearly stating what the goals are, what everybody wants out of the project.
I'm going to be, maybe playing like pseudo psychologist here. So take this with a grain of salt. And my hunch is that, when we're working by ourselves, it's a combination of how we're feeling at the time, about the instructions and the logical data that we're trying to apply and the to-do list that we're working through. And then also our instincts of like why we think this is going to work and what makes it worth it for us to get up and do it. And I think we are really good at communicating the to-do lists, whether it's user stories or OKRs or whatever else, depending on the granularity. Not as great as communicating how we feel about it. Do we feel excited about this? Do we feel afraid about certain things? Or our instincts in terms of what did we interpret in terms of what's going to likely happen? What's our sense tell us? And the fact that we don't communicate those as well leads to a lot of assumptions when we're now working as a team. Because now, say you and I even in making episodes will sometimes have different viewpoints on things. And if we don't talk about it clearly, or sometimes it takes us a little bit of friction to arrive at, oh, that's what you meant here in the first place. And thankfully, we've got good communication rapport. It did take us a while to get there. And I think the same thing with product teams, where leaning into it and communicating what the priorities are, why we think it's going to work, what does our census tell us, and also stating them as such. Like I think a recent guest, Don Berger, kind of talked about some advice in terms of how leaders can better communicate their feelings and instincts. I think are something we don't do well, to answer your question about why it starts to get hard to do for teams. And then also, maybe a solution to that in terms of how we can overcome it.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product design or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show.
All right, the next question that we have here is from the Reddit for Startups, and it's on pushing through the mental drain from user Vida4TISNK. And they ask this: I'm building my first startup, and it's around a pain point that I feel in my day-to-day. This drove me to spend hours on end into the evening and weekends, and I've built a strong early access platform. But I cannot, for the life of me, explain succinctly what the value add is, why people should care, who should care, and how it can help them. I'm failing at it. I don't know what to do, and it's draining me. How do you practice revising your calls and demos into a 2 to 3 sentence explanation that drives interest and curiosity without requiring a walkthrough? This is my first startup, and it's making me feel like I'm failing. Once it clicks, they're sold. But that's way too cumbersome of a process. I have a decent amount of validation, but my potential customers are at the B2B enterprise org, but only the ICs see the value.
All right. I think there's a few things to unpack here, and all fairly common. The first one that I had is that the listener is having trouble with articulating the value add. The second one is especially doing that without having a product demo or walkthrough. And the third one is that, for this B2B enterprise type of solution, it's mostly the individual contributors, is my assumption of what they meant by ICs, and maybe not the folks who have the budget and authority to purchase this that are seeing the value the same way. I think this is especially typical when you build a product to scratch your own itch, like this listener has done. And I noticed it a little bit more amongst technical founders. And the good news is that once it clicks, they're sold. So I'm going to make this assumption that you already have some customers, and maybe at this point, you're struggling to scale that customer base or scale your sales process, maybe even take yourself out of it, whether it's delegating to a salesperson or delegating to marketing and a website if you want it to be more self-serve. So for the first one around articulating that value add, I think in my opinion, the easiest way to find how to do that is by asking your customers how you do it. And if you've already got some customers in the bag, the folks who, for once it clicks, they're sold, find ways to get in front of them, incentivize them, whether it's by giving them free upgrades on your product. Some people will kind of hand out gift cards or AirPods or other ways. You only have to talk to 5 to 10 of these customers. Check out this episode on jobs to be done with Andrew Glazer, where he gets into detail about how to conduct these interviews and how, talking to 10 people is plenty. So you're not necessarily going to break the budget with the incentives. That being said, I'll say a lot of the times, if the customers are really passionate about the solution you provide, they will oftentimes be pretty amenable to hopping on a call with them and allowing you to go deep dive. I think it's really important that you do that versus a survey. For the stage that I feel like you're at, you're not ready for a survey. I think the survey is better once you've already got big chunks of instincts and then you want to assign some quantities to them. Since you're still in the qualitative phase of your research, I like a 1-hour phone call, and it allows you to take the conversation any which way. And typically after the 5th or 6th call, you start to notice a lot of trends and patterns. You also start to notice language that your customers use that you may not use yourself to describe themselves, to describe the problem that it's solving, and then describing your solution. Which brings me to another thing that I have made the mistake of myself, and I notice a lot of technical founders especially doing, is that we jump to articulating the value through the solution that we've put together. And that could be a walkthrough, it could be a demo, and we forget to talk about who it's for and what it's for before we talk about what it does. So I think in this case, one of the other things to do is zooming back out and trying to understand who it is that you're serving. You mentioned ICs, so you've already got sort of a little bit of a persona being built, and building on that a little bit more, especially in the lens of how you can go find more of these customers, whether it's online or through other sales processes, is going to be the first step. The second one is understanding the problem that you solve and articulating it using your customer's language. And the only way you can do that is by asking them. It's way faster to do that rather than trying to sort of intuit what they describe the problem to be. So save yourself that hassle, go find the customers and just have them describe what life was like before they had your solution, and you'll start to get a little bit more insights. And then and only then, after you've figured out who it's for and what it's for, would I focus on doing the walkthroughs or the demos or articulating the solution there. And I think that flow tends to make it a lot easier for customers to self-select out or based on who they are or the problem that they have. And then the ones who have it will hopefully get to understanding the value that you add a lot sooner because they're able to relate to it a lot better based on some kind of headache or maybe even a migraine that they're facing today. So that's the first couple of things I'm thinking about, sort of articulating the value add and doing it without a demo.
Well, I'm curious if you feel like ego plays a factor here as well. I mean, I think a lot of people like to think that they are unique and that the problems and solutions that they have are unique. And so in this case, you have someone that is fixing a pain point that they feel every day. And I'm going to make a guess and say that if you're a founder of a startup, you probably even have a little bit of extra, like I am unique. And so then when it comes to communicating who something is for, you know, getting down to like, why does this affect a lot of humans, not just me? Maybe that's a little bit more difficult for people that are founding startups.
100%. I don't know if it's specifically ego or not, but I think the common thread there is we're all prone to disillusionment, right? And you need to have some healthy dose of that if you're going to do something as improbable as starting a company. And so that can be healthy or unhealthy. And I think the short circuit of getting the best of both worlds there is trusting those instincts and your assumptions and, you know, playing with maybe a little bit of imagination, maybe even disillusionment, but then also verifying those instincts with data. And to your point, I think talking to customers is like a very easy way, in my opinion, to do that, and in a very content dense and rich way. where, yeah, that 60 minutes is easily worth, a $200 gift card a lot of the times. Of course, that varies based on what the margins are in your business and stuff. But if you feel like it's something that a lot more people have a problem around and could solve, I feel like using their language versus your own is a short circuit. And then the other thing that comes to mind here from their question that I want to touch on is they say that I think it was that it's mostly the ICs or individual contributors that see the value versus, they said B2B enterprise. So I'm assuming maybe it's their boss's boss that has to sign off on like an enterprise-wide license, whereas they could go sign up with their credit card, the individual contributors just by themselves. And this one is a little bit more complex. I think there are a lot of opportunities through understanding your customers better and the value proposition that they solve that you can also kind of get further into, like, yeah, I understand how this solves this problem for you, but let's try and think about what this does for your manager or your manager's manager, and how does this help at a departmental level? And then maybe even transition with caution into thinking about product-led growth, where maybe it makes it really easy for those ICs to purchase. And then you maybe gate some of the features where the teams get the value of collaborating with each other. And then at that point, it's either a much bigger check size that they have to sign, or that's when you engage like your sales team, where that the folks that your sales team's talking to are highly qualified because there's at least a couple of internal champions there that can help you with internal case studies and proofs of concept, so that they know that what they're buying is valuable. It's a matter of figuring out budgets and other things. Oftentimes, I think enterprise sales get stalled because there is a lot of snake oil out there, and folks have been burned time and time again with buying stuff that doesn't work, and you're at a much further ahead spot than they may consider because you have internal proof points. I think one great example is Calendly, where they give it away for free, even where if you or I, Doug, want to help make it easier for people to schedule time on our calendars, they just give it away for free. But now if we are doing a recording where it requires both of us available at that time, now that's a paid feature where it syncs both of our calendars. And that goes from being convenient for myself or yourself as individuals to now unblocking our business for this podcast. And so it becomes a business problem from a personal problem. And usually those end up having a lot more value associated with them. Again, I think the customer research is, if there's one thing you want to take away from this answer, it's go find 5, ideally 10 customers to go talk to and incentivize them in some form to give you an hour, and then follow the jobs to be done framework to make the most out of that hour.
And the Calendly example is interesting because it's a layered thing, right? You have to understand what is the problem that you're solving. My calendar's all over the place and I need some help figuring that out. And then what's the thing that the person will then pay for? What's the net? Once they get in to the free thing, what's the thing that they'll actually pay for? And it's like, oh, I want to do these sort of more complicated, multi-person, elaborate things. Okay, well now that's a specific problem as opposed to sort of a general problem. So that's interesting. I'm also curious about another thing, because you just ended there with customer research. So I know that everybody's product is going to present different the specifics of different questions that they would want to ask to dig down. But when you're advising people on customer research, what are some like general starter pack ideas to be thinking of in terms of questions that you would ask in one of those customer research situations?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that kind of somewhat sequential way that I think about it. It starts with who it's for, and then you get to what it's for before you get to what it does. In other words, when we're doing customer research, initially, I'm making sure to understand who this person is, what their role is in this case, if it's a B2B solution, what kind of problems they are tasked with solving. Notice that I didn't say title, I said role, because there's different titles in different places, but understanding the role as well as the title tends to provide an additional layer of context in terms of understanding the next set of questions, which is the problem that they're facing. And so when it comes to the problem, it's really trying to understand a few things. What was life like before this solution came about? How bad was that if this thing were to happen? How often does it happen? How many people does it affect? And you can start to sort of segment out between the problems they talk about, the ones that are really painful, the migraines, if you will, versus the ones that are headaches that, we've all got headaches and we don't even take the ibuprofen, but as soon as we have a migraine, we're reaching to solve that in some kind of capacity. So that's the sequence, I would say. Figure out who they are, understand what life was like before your solution came about, and different ways to understand the problem. And then the third one, and only then do we start to talk about the solution. Oftentimes, we don't even get into the solution in the early stages that it seems like this person is in. The solution testing is usually on the usability testing, where like, hey, this person has this problem. Our solution should solve it. But does this UI really work? Is it easy enough for them to use? Is it intuitive enough? I don't worry about that stuff until knowing that, yeah, this problem is really like something that's worth solving in the first place for this subset of folks. Another book that comes to mind is the book Mom Test, which has a number of great examples of how to ask these questions really well. And the underlying premise is that if you have this amazing app idea and then you go and ask your mom whether she would buy it, your mom wants you to succeed no matter what. And so she's probably going to say yes. And what you can do is instead even take someone who's as biased as your mom and convert this into a valuable, unbiased interview by being more curious. Don't ask yes or no questions. Ask questions about how often, what was it like, when does it happen, to understand triggers and so forth. And that way, you're not focusing so much on, hey, is this a yes or no of whether you like my product or not? You're asking deeper questions of, hey, is this problem exists, and does this problem worth solving? And that requires a little bit more open-endedness. And then, a lot of homework and synthesis afterwards. We usually like sticky notes so we can move them close to each other and have affinities and other things in the trends that we see. The other thing is, I think the language that folks use is oftentimes something that I would ignore. And I'd go back to using the language that I use to describe the problem or the solution. And the chances are someone who's your customer is going to relate to someone else who's your customer and likely use the same language, especially if they're in a legal company or an accounting company or something where they're going to have their own industry jargon and lingo, and you want to try and marry that as much as possible. The last thing I'll leave off with is if you're trying to do marketing, whether in social media or on your website, where you're not there to explain to get it to click, switch from telling to asking. From the insights that come from this research, you'll oftentimes be able to surface questions around how do you solve this problem? Or how often does this happen? And I think those are really compelling things that will engage folks if they're questions they're already asking themselves as they kind of discovered your product and then had the aha. So that's kind of a last thing that I leave off. And again, I think the jobs to be done framework is a great way to put a little bit of structure and not burn too many cycles or trust with your customers, where you're not showing them a ton of value in return for the time that they're giving you to be interviewed.
All right, great stuff. We move from the startup Reddit back to the product management Reddit, and user Legal Apartment 2564 is struggling in their first senior PM role and wants to know what you would have done differently, or what anyone would have done differently in their situation. So here's the post. I recently completed my first year in a senior AI PM role at a large US tech company, and my performance review was rough. One of the worst I've ever received in my career. In short, I underdelivered. I'm trying to understand where I went wrong and how to avoid this in the future. Here's the context. I was based in Europe, but my team, engineering, product peers, managers, were entirely in the United States, 9 hours behind me. My day often started at 5 p.m. and went until 8:30 p.m. with back-to-back calls. I was managing 3 concurrent AI-related projects, initially 5, but it was scaled down, and I had no local engineering team. Here's the feedback that I received. Stakeholders didn't feel that I added value. Partner PMs gave indirect negative feedback to my manager. My manager felt that I stayed too high level and didn't know the details or tech deeply enough. Engineers felt that I wasn't close to the team or the product. My EM regularly complained I wasn't engaged enough in getting to know the core tech. And I focused too much on strategy instead of shipping small wins and helping the team out with the micro. Now that I'm out of that role, in a soft way, I think I was pushed out. I've apologized to stakeholders, but I feel lost. I genuinely cared about the domain and worked long hours, but clearly did not approach things in the right way. What would you have done differently in my shoes? How do you navigate a remote, cross-time zone PM role and still go deep and add value? Any advice would be appreciated. I'm looking to reflect and grow from this.
And that's a tough situation. So the first question I think was, what would I have done differently? I think while we're on the feedback topic, trying to get that early and often is something that I think can help at least short circuit the surprise level of this. And so there's a manager that I heard, there were stakeholders that I heard, there's an engineering manager. And for each of these folks, there's different levels of granularity, I think, that creating that kind of feedback and asking how you're doing on a regular basis. Like the engineering manager, I imagine you're interacting with on a daily basis. So asking for that weekly is not something that is going to be too out of line. It may require a little bit of trust building and asking them of a favor. But if you're able to respond to the feedback or at least clarify the feedback, then I think that trust can show up. It's going to go a lot further than an apology to show some really actionable steps that you are looking to rectify the fact that they feel like you're not necessarily detailed enough. Same thing with a manager, and depending on the organization, sometimes it could be weekly, bi-weekly, monthly kind of touch point that you can kind of get with them. And even if they don't have great feedback initially, I'd say the discipline of continuing to ask them will hopefully generate better feedback. They'll maybe put a little bit more thought into it when they know that it's a question you're going to keep asking. It's not going to go away. And they'll start to look for signal around them that ultimately did make its way into the performance review. They just might be a little bit more intentional around it. And when it comes to stakeholders not seeing value, that's something I remember. And, there's a couple of things about this. Number one, what is the product manager role? This is something that's evolving quite a lot. If you go to a traditional company, a product manager may be a little bit more of a translator and maybe closer to a scrum master than someone who owns many business outcomes. You're making sure that the trains run on time. If you go to a more mature company where all the business stakeholders are fairly technical and don't need a translator, then you probably have some business outcomes. Maybe it's increasing customer metrics. Maybe it's even revenue. Maybe it's even profitability related when it comes to the outcomes of the decisions you're making in your product role. So clarifying what that is pretty early, I think, is pretty important. It's a role that has always been ambiguous, and I think even more so as the industry becomes more tech savvy. Communicating early and often, not just receiving feedback, but also keeping your stakeholders abreast of what you're working on, what kind of assumptions you're making, what kind of instincts you have. Oftentimes, I think making more requests of them and working back from that is another way of showing that you're thinking about things, or at least course correcting what you're thinking about. Making more asks of them are in the form of maybe you need more budget, maybe you need more approvals on something, maybe you need more engineers on your team, because you're really thinking big, but also working back to how you're going to execute it. That's another piece that I think in today's day and age, it sounded like you were kind of working very high level, or at least that's what the feedback was. That might be the case if you're in an organization that needs someone in product strategy. Nowadays, I think you want folks who can straddle both the strategy and execution, which means you can work on the business side and understand where this product needs to be 3 years or a year out, but also work on the engineering side and know pretty well what they built in the last week, in the last month, and are able to short circuit all of this stuff together, ideally with some data and analytics. And so hopefully you're able to be more malleable and get a little bit more into the details. I know that's not always the case for everybody, but that's the thing that I would say is pretty important in most product roles today, is to stay pretty close. And what was the next piece? Was it on remote, Doug?
Yeah, exactly. So how do you How do you sort of establish those relationships when you're not only remote, but you're remote over several time zones where oftentimes you're working when no one else is and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, again, it varies so much based on the organization, and so I'm just going to give you more answers, and hopefully a couple of them kind of fit your circumstance. If you're at a company that doesn't have a well-established remote cadence, then there's a lot of assumptions. Maybe you're the first remote PM that they've hired if all the engineers are in the US. And so there's likely some reasons why you were hired, and they kind of interrupted that pattern of hiring US folks and hired someone in Europe. Understanding why that is, but also stating the risks associated and finding mitigations for those around how you do time zones is something that I think it's really important to establish that really early. Similar to the other answer, I think we tend to kind of create a lot of assumptions. We don't communicate our feelings or our hunches and instincts as well. And getting that all out there is super important because you're swimming upstream trying to build trust with your engineering team that is in a different time zone than you are. If it's possible, I would say getting out there in the US and spending a week a month or a week a quarter is another way where when you're in person with them, or at least in the same time zone, you have the ability to build a lot of ritual and discipline, and most importantly, trust, which then you can add some assumptions or complication to around trying to do it across oceans and time zones. Not having sort of the base recipe and then trying to do the gluten-free time zone recipe can be really risky. So if budget, timelines, and circumstances allow, I am a huge proponent of spending in-person time that's very intentional. And if you're not sure what to do with that in-person time compared to the time that you're back remote, oftentimes it's around validating assumptions that are in the plan, whether it's around business, product, technical architecture, UI. Try to kind of talk with yourself first and then discuss out loud with your team and get them to hole poke or double down on the assumptions that you have. We've put out a Crucial Conversations episode in season 1, which could be a pretty good agenda, I think, for what you do with the in-person time initially to get on the same page. And then I think just churning out work day in and day out when you're in person gives you a really strong model of what you're trying to replicate over time zones, when things are more asynchronous and things are more remote. So I think those are another set of things that come to mind in terms of how you can short circuit some of these risks that come about from being in a different continent than a lot of your team.
You might have mentioned this already. What do you think about almost oversharing what you're doing? You know, even if it's not sort of, there's not a system in place set up to say, here's what I've been accountable for today, but just sort of going ahead and getting ahead of that and saying, here's what I did today, and just being oversharing in that way. Would that be something that you advise?
100%. I think different organizations use different tools and technology for this. At Integral, we would send out a daily email or a daily Slack message, depending on what the team wanted. And it just kind of talks about what we did today, what was accomplished, what we wanted to do, but maybe couldn't get to, what we're blocked on, what big risks came up. And, you know, a lot of the time it could just be noise. And you want to make sure that you have some kind of maybe alerting system where we would, put status red in the subject, or we would highlight the text as red in Slack when we needed someone to respond to something, or we put status yellow. Whereas if it's status green, maybe on the weekend or whenever someone's catching up on emails, they can get a synthesis of it and have a pretty good idea of what kind of value you were adding. And this could be not necessarily just to kind of protect your job here. I think the way to think about it is that if you're working on the wrong thing and you're communicating it, then everyone else has an opportunity to highlight or ask you a question of, hey, why were you even spending any time on that? We don't need any help with strategy. We need more help with architecture, or the engineering team needs more help with context. And it provides more field time, I would say, for folks to react to. And the earlier they can do that, the less charged that tends to be, the fewer surprises, the earlier you have the opportunity to really earn a lot of trust by responding in a timely way versus waiting till you get this critical feedback. And I think the other thing to consider is that no one likes giving hard feedback. It's most important things that I think a lot of folks avoid. but it's uncomfortable. So it's oftentimes delayed unless you take control of how you get your feedback. So leaning into it and helping your colleagues through that discomfort is another way that you can short circuit some of the surprises for yourself. Another thing, kind of a tangent, I kind of did start off the remote answer with saying, like, if this organization's new to remote, there may be other organizations that are really good and mature at remote. Companies like Envision back in the day were leaders. We had Farhan from Shopify on talk about how they work remotely. And there's a lot of norms that come into play that overcome some of the risks that are presented by remote work. And finding out how your company overcomes that. If they haven't documented it, you may need to kind of be that person who goes and talks to the other remote employees or the folks, the engineering managers that work with the remote employees, and kind of be that first to try and create a set of norms and disciplines and principles for your company. And not only is that a way that you can show that you're adding some value, but it's a way that you can help de-risk your role here, and hopefully very quickly start to earn some trust back and have your company be optimistic about continuing to collaborate with you.
All right. Well, good luck to Legal Apartment on that next opportunity. Buckle in, Ashok, because this next one is complex. It's going to be a long question, and it's a serious situation that I'm sure a lot of people are involved in these days. And the title of this post from the Product Management Reddit is called "Leadership Has Not Made Up Their Mind on Whether We Are a Service Company or a Product Company." And the Reddit user here is Nexus1997. I've been at a fintech for about 9 months now. The whole product team has been around for 2 years, with the average tenure being 1 year. Their past product experience ranges between 2 to 4 years. For the first 6 months, we were focused on just one B2B client, and the dev process was simply waterfall. Client says do A, we place it in some quarter based on sizing, and then we get approval from the client, and then we build because there was only one client. Now we have 2 more clients whose asks are around the same themes above, but the solutions are divergent from client A. And so this has led to an issue in the following 2 ways. 1, solutions are being implemented in parallel, sometimes leading to conflicts and unexpected behavior. 2, prioritization is in the gutter because people build what they can, not what they should, leading to duplication. I propose to my CPO that we have a prioritization framework set up to be able to decide how to sequence our work and also push back against one-off asks and set up reporting lines so that at least one person takes the call on how our product should be built. The CPO can't and won't do this. The response was in the negative. Let the clients decide what we build, and we need to be flat, so no reporting lines. It comes as no surprise that we don't exactly have a strategy. I've started seeing symptoms of this problem already. For example, a few days before release, a team introduced something into the build that breaks our product for client A. The effect is that our release is delayed by 2 weeks, and leadership is starting to blame product, tech, QA for an unstable environment. And number 2, design has infighting over the direction to take due to conflicting requirements. The conflict led to one of the leads being shuffled around, having a single lead for the whole product. So that's a lot, Ashok. The main question here from Nexus is, what can I do?
Now that is a complex situation, a few things to unpack here. So I'm going to try and kind of do the short form of the challenge. This company sounds like they had a customer, which is, don't get me wrong, hard to get. And they were kind of building things relatively custom for this customer, and were kind of order takers, if you will. And good news for the business, they were able to add more clients, which is obviously very critical in growing any business. And I think, in this case, they may have said 2 more clients, and there is something around the number 3 there that kind of validates that this is a business, and this problem that you're solving at least is one that's worth solving, and that you've kind of gotten some semblance of like who tends to have this problem. These are all the good news pieces. The bad news, I think, is something that is pretty typical for companies that are transitioning from their first customer into then adapting to customers 2, 3, 4, and so forth. Of course, there's a huge number of benefits in terms of finding commonalities and efficiencies so that you're doing minimal parallel work. Because the chances are these customers are going to be paying you the same amount. And if you can ship them all the same product versus 3 different products, then your business has got a lot more margin and efficiency in there. The challenge here, oftentimes, we've already touched on this in one of the earlier answers today, is that we get sucked into a disorder-taking mindset. And a symptom of that oftentimes is that the customer is being extremely prescriptive in what the solution looks like, not just what problem they're having. So going back to that customer problem solution thing, we're playing on the very surface level of the solution, which, yes, your customer is probably not experts at designing architecture or designing UI UX, and therefore are going to kind of ask for what makes the most sense to them today. They're certainly not thinking about any other customers and don't have the same value that you do by having other customers, not in the short term anyway. So one fix, I think the first one, is that we need to start getting really opinionated if you want to get all the financial and scale benefits that a product company has versus a services company. And that opinionation comes with a risk because you're placing bets now versus just taking orders. But these bets are ones that are likely to give you a lot of scale and avoid a lot of the problems that this user or listener is talking about. In order to be opinionated, it's really hard to do at the solution level. It's way easier as you kind of go further into those concentric circles of customer problem solution. And they did mention something along the lines of the customers are asking for things within a similar theme. I would place my $20 chip saying that the similar theme there is that both customers have the same problem in some capacity. They just personally have gone about ideating how to go about the solution in different ways. And that's the point where there's a very uncomfortable process required for your team to understand that problem really, really well for each of your customers, and then understand what's in common, what's different, and then address your architecture based on the commonalities and the differences. The commonalities may become kind of this common set of libraries or a common, what some companies call a platform. And then the differences, we got to make a decision of how we're going to address them. We will either make sort of the custom pieces on the edges. So already you kind of have like a much bigger common surface area and then smaller bespoke areas. That could be something that you expose from the platform via API, where your customer can go out and make their kind of customizations themselves, where you're on hook for making sure that your platform and the APIs work really well. And the customer is on the hook for making sure that their customization on top of that works really well. Now, maybe your company ends up doing that customization, but you can charge them a services fee or non-recurring engineering and various ways in which, from a budgetary standpoint, as well as a prioritization standpoint, everyone knows what's core platform and what's a bespoke customization there, while also giving your customers the flexibility of, if they really want that solution to look as bespoke as they want for some reason, that's a decision they can be involved in making. Where there's sort of an opinionated solution that you put together that should hopefully work because you've put a good amount of research and validation into forming this opinion, that oftentimes I would say the customer will change their mind about whether or not they really needed those customizations and so bespoke when the rubber hits the road and they own some piece of the pain of kind of bringing that last 5% of what customization they need. And they're usually just happy with the 95%. They're not delighted, but they're happy enough that they're going to continue using it and they're going to continue building the relationship with you. And sometimes having a really consistent product that works over time and doesn't fail, like what you mentioned, is what leads to delight in the long term versus whiz-bang show things in the short term that don't eventually work reliably in the long term. I do want to add one last point here, where if functionality that you're adding for one customer is breaking the build for the other customer, there may be some level of improvements, not just on the strategy and product side, but also on the technical and QA side that can be brought into being, whether it's test automation, CI/CD, and other ways to look for these kind of regressions that the engineering team owns so that these kind of build breaking pushes to production don't happen. So it's not just around product strategy. I think there's also maybe some room for improvement on the engineering team side here. And then as your platform gets a lot more complex and you're trying to cater to more use cases, you're going to get more and more value out of this test suite than you did maybe day one. So that's another thing that I think I would highly strongly recommend that your team carve out some time to do, in addition to a lot of the product fixes that we talked about.
So it sounds like part of the solution here for this particular user is to just have their leadership team listen to you and listen to your podcast and listen to that segment there to hopefully convince them that, you know, if you want to go from 3 to 30 customers, that this isn't a sustainable way to continue to operate, making these bespoke, you know, product changes for each team. Because it seems like this person that's writing here is not part of the leadership team necessarily, but is having difficulty convincing that leadership team that this is really a problem. And so I hear you on the, you know, making sure that all of the engineering things are taken care of and not blaming it solely on strategy. But what if you do it, not even if you're just a part of a product team, but maybe you're even a senior part of a product team, but you're having difficulty communicating to leaders in the C-suite that, hey, the way we're doing this thing is not sustainable and we have to change. Otherwise, it's eventually going to sort of fall apart.
It kind of depends on who you're talking to. So I'm going to make some assumptions on people in the C-suite. So there's a head of sales probably. And the more you can kind of differentiate between what your opinions are and what kind of insights and market research have led to those opinions and insights, the more confident you can be in a room and the more someone is going to find credibility in you versus someone who's an order taker, right? So I think marketing and sales would really like that. Once you have a pretty good opinion of what problems you solve and who you're solving them for, that's going to give marketing a lot more focus too on where they can go and advertise or generate top of the funnel stuff or sales materials that help close the deals, because you know what your core competencies are, you know what your opinions are. For senior leadership or maybe finance, there is a very clear profitability exercise, I think, in terms of the what's in it for them, where if you got to do 3 times as much work to get paid 3x compared to maybe 1.5x the amount of work to get paid 3 times, there's a lot more profit left in the bank that we can put towards various things compared to if you're going to work more like a services company. And to the board, ultimately that profitability and the repeatability and efficiencies drive up the valuations of your business. If you're looking to sell this business, if you're looking to take a loan or some kind of funding, there's less that you have to give up in order to get more money. So I think these are very business problems that manifest as technical ways here that senior leadership certainly should consider. And I mean, it's easier than said than done. And having been the person who's in the senior leadership role, if someone is sitting in that seat, I will commiserate that going back to your customers and pushing back to them and telling them that they can't have what they're asking for is uncomfortable. I will wager that oftentimes that discomfort is short-lived, because if you're able to articulate where your opinions are formed, if you're able to clarify with your customer the assumptions that you're making and make sure that you're not building opinions on invalid assumptions as far as what their needs are and who they are and what they're trying to do with it, then you start to build a little bit of trust and relatability and credibility that, hey, you're not turning them down for no reason. You're turning them down despite understanding where they're coming from, and then showing them an elegant solution that's been thought through that can solve their problem, albeit not exactly the way they asked for. And that discomfort, I think, is the difference between niceness and kindness sometimes, where we avoid the discomfort and we're nice and we build up some trust debt for the long term, versus we can be candid and kind and really have the customer's best interest in heart in the long term, but have to go through some level of discomfort in terms of doing that trust building and sharing with them very openly and honestly. Also inviting them into the solution and giving them options versus having it sound like a really hard negotiation. This is something that can be a really friendly conversation if you can prove to your customers that you do have their interest at heart in the long term. You're just like trying to do it in a very sustainable way so that the collaboration can be long term versus something that flames out very quickly.
All right, last question here from the product management Reddit from user not me, not you, not me, not. And this question is on doing regular one-to-ones with engineers. I've been doing this for a while, started when the team was on shaky ground with lots of turnover. I do them monthly, but I don't think they're as valuable now that the team has stabilized, and in fact, potentially troublesome as soft decisions can be made in a one-to-one, causing extra work to align the rest of the team. I'm thinking about canceling them instead for ad hoc ones as needed, but wondering if these regular one-to-ones with engineers are something that I should continue moving forward.
This is a little bit of a complicated topic, and I've burnt my fingers myself a few times on this. If you were to ask me whether you should do one-on-ones or not do one-on-ones, I'm going to give you a very annoying answer of it depends. I think generally speaking, from a generational standpoint, the boomers, the Gen X, the millennials, we went from annual reviews to maybe semi-annual reviews to us millennials who are really needy and needing feedback and validation a lot more often. There's a Gallup study, I think, that said that millennials require 7 points of positive feedback for every 1 point of critical feedback. Now, that's a very high carb, poop sandwich, if you will. But I think the signal there is that we like ongoing feedback and validation. And whether that's from our managers or we find a way to get that internally is a whole other question. But on the very other side of the poll, I think a lot of folks really celebrated when Jensen Huang, the CEO and founder of NVIDIA, said he doesn't do one-on-ones. And it creates a lot of confusion and politics and issues in his org. And I don't think he's wrong there either. There's a little bit to be taken from both sides. And my annoying answer of it depends, I'll try and help you discern which one's for you. One, I think you're on the right track totally. If your team's on a shaky ground and you don't have a good pulse on how to read the signal versus the noise and gain some sense of understanding of where your team's at and interject and intervene before problems get too big, yes, having a very ongoing, regular, scheduled, monthly is super helpful. I think in other cases, if things are kind of stabilized, then there isn't a problem that you're actively solving. But there is. It's just a lot more implicit. So when it was explicit, you had kind of turmoil or shaky ground on your team, and everyone kind of knew okay, this is the war or the battle to be fought and won. When things are going really well, then people are thinking beyond, right? If your product's going really well and you're not kind of struggling, then you're thinking about what next. And the same is true for your team members, where they're hey, you know what? I feel like I'm doing pretty well at my job right now, and I could use a little bit more challenge. And if there isn't some level of direction that you're providing or opinion that you're stating on that second one, then it can become a really complicated conversation. I personally have been in the situation where we would talk to our folks about what their career aspirations were and didn't really form an opinion initially about what kind of problems we anticipated needing them to solve. And initially, those conversations were fraught with confusion because people would kind of have their career aspirations all over the place without any sort of guardrails in terms of what makes sense at Integral. And as we started to think through where this company's headed, what sort of problems we want to solve for our customers in the future, where the market's going, what kind of tools we'll have, we had a much better idea of what kind of things we needed to arm and equip our internal teams for so that we can really avoid having to hire senior talent from the outside when we could very well be fostering them internally. So those conversations got a lot better as we were able to help people not ask them an open-ended question of what do you want to do when you grow up, but instead kind of help facilitate a conversation out of, hey, out of these 3 or 4 tracks, which one do you feel most compelled and called towards? And then at that point, you've got a little bit more context and alignment that you can then turn into some kind of a plan where you're helping plant seeds that this person feels like you're opinionated and a leader. They feel like you care and you're asking. And then third, I think it's putting together some kind of plan and investment in them, whether it's time, some combination of time and monetary investment, whether it's a training program or something. And then fourth, some level of accountability or helping them with facilitating their own progress by checking in or maybe giving them challenges, assigning them to work on things that are slightly outside their comfort zone, but aligned with where they want to go. Without having that opinion, it can get very open-ended, and you're maybe doing these one-on-ones to build trust, and it can have this counterintuitive effect of you're eroding trust, because I could be someone who's kind of saying for the fifth or sixth time now that I want to work on this stuff. And that's just not something that's maybe available at the company when there was maybe their second or third option that was very well available that you didn't explore. So I think understanding why you want to have these one-on-ones, stating these problems for yourself as a manager, what does it do for the direct, what does it do for the business, and then making agendas that kind of check that off is a way. Another thing I really like to do with my directs is once we've kind of understood where they want to go from a career standpoint, maybe that's a conversation I'd have with them once a quarter. And then also what we want to achieve that quarter and what they're accountable for. Oftentimes our one-on-ones would be kind of rolling up our sleeves and doing a screen share and helping solve some of the things that they were feeling more uncertain or blocked on. It gave me a little bit more of window of data points to connect from kind of more the grassroots level so that I can make a more informed strategic picture, and also where as a leader my time was best served for them. And then solving a problem together, I think, is an amazing way to build trust with your directs. And I know a lot of our engineering managers would kind of pair program with their directs too, as a way to kind of solve problems together, build trust, and also be able to share some level of mentorship and coaching at the same time. This person mentioned that they're switching to ad hoc. It's hard for me to say since I don't know your team, but I would be willing to guess that some of the folks are going to really welcome this change, and others are going to feel like they're missing out on something, and maybe even sometimes not sure why. So having a one-on-one conversation, no pun intended, of trying to figure out who's which, and some of them maybe you can cancel next week and then switch to ad hoc. Others, maybe you go from monthly to every other month or quarterly or something. So there's a little bit more of a soft off ramp, I think, can be really helpful for them. And then for the folks who are going ad hoc, I think it's pretty important to make sure that, hey, when do we do this ad hoc? What is this? What are the set of circumstances that we reinvoke? Whether as a manager, what am I going to do? When do I think I need this? And then for yourself as well, as the direct, what's going to cause you, and what are the scenarios that you would like for them to say, hey, I could use a one-on-one. And that way you're continuing with the habit, just switching to a more event-based one than a time-based one, because otherwise I think it can cause some levels of confusion,
I'm sure there's some analogy to like pushing a product update, and that's when you get the emails all of a sudden from customers you haven't heard from in a long time when something changes, because people, you may have thought, oh, that's not going to affect them, but then all of a sudden it does.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And, if you switch to ad hoc and you get a calendar invite from your manager, especially without a ton of context in the calendar invite, that could change your afternoon or your week or whatever, depending on when this meeting is. So having the kind of rules of engagement of when we reinvoke, and then also just state why you want this to the best of your ability. You may not even know what you want to achieve from the meeting. You just kind of know, like, hey, this is a problem I want to solve with you. And that in itself can maybe make things a lot more clear for folks.
So what I'm hearing is communication, intentionality, understanding your why, a lot of the same themes that come up time in and time again on this show about building the best teams that build the best products. So a lot of this stuff very familiar. If you've listened to the show, and maybe this is your first time, we've referenced a lot of our past episodes. We will put links to those in the show notes. And if you have a question, you can contact him via DM. The social links are in the show notes of this podcast episode as well, or you can go to the website. And what's that website again?
Convergence.fm, and then there's a contact page where I love it when folks use the record feature, or you can type up a message too.
Perfect. Thank you, Ashok, for taking the time here to answer some of these hard problems that folks are having out in building the best products and building the best teams to build the best products.
Thanks, man. Glad you could join us again.
Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.